Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the WWF Insider Series virtual event. My name is Jake Sokol, and I work with WWF donors on the East Coast. In a couple minutes, I'll introduce Erin Simon, our head of plastic waste and business. Before we get started, I want to explain how this presentation is a bit different from past ones. You might remember last August's episode featuring Erin discussing WWF's effort to turn the tide on plastics in nature. It's okay if you don't remember that presentation, as it was a long time ago, and we're going to replay it in just a minute to refresh our memories. Following the rerun, Erin and I will sit down for a candid conversation about the progress made in the last 11 months toward a vision of no plastics in nature by 2030. As a note, this webinar has been pre-recorded, so unfortunately we won't be able to take questions live. However, if you do have a question following the event, please email events@wwfus.org and we'll do our best to get an answer for you. Now, for today's topic, plastic is found in every corner of the world, and for many of us, it's a modern convenience that we now depend on. Plastics make our hospitals safer, our food lasts longer, our packages more efficient to ship, but the amount of plastic we now see in nature has become a crisis. Plastic particles have been found in the most remote environments, in our food and water, and hundreds of wildlife species. Everyday plastic items that end up as waste in nature will take hundreds of years to degrade, negatively impacting ecosystems and their inhabitants in ways we are just beginning to understand. Solving this crisis will require a coordinated collaboration on an unprecedented scale, and WWF is leading the charge. By uniting our global network of industry leaders, consumers, and policymakers, we are transforming our systems so the plastics we discard become plastics we use again. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Erin Simon, WWF's head of plastic waste and business, about the work she is doing to engage with companies on the crucial role they play in finding solutions for this issue. Without further ado, here's the replay of the last session, and we will follow up with a conversation afterwards.
Thanks so much, Jake. Appreciate it. I'm really excited to be here today. Talking about some of my, some of the most important issues we're working on. I thought I'd start just and share a little bit about my background, so you guys know where I come from. I have been at World Wildlife Fund for 9 years. I just had my pandiversary. And before that, I was at Hewlett Packard for 10 years. And before that, I was learning how to become a packaging engineer and material scientist. But what I really like about material science is the ability to really reimagine how we think about materials and how we use them to make lives better and to do more. And so when I first started out my career, it was a really focused on innovation, right? But I realized pretty early on that there was this inequitable amount of time that I spent as a designer, as an engineer, on figuring out how do we use the materials. I didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about where they came from or what I did when I was done with them. So as I came to World Wildlife Fund, my role was really to help companies like I had, where I came from, to rethink, how we were using materials and how we were sourcing them and to make better decisions. And so today I'm going to talk about a specific issue in the material science space, which is the plastic waste issue. I'm going to share a bit about what WWF is doing to address it. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what my part in that is. And then I'm going to help you guys to understand what part you can play in it. Because we truly all do have a role to play. And so I'm going to start with some images of this issue. And this is one of the things that WWF does so well, right? We take you to a place by showing you pictures, right? And unfortunately, some of these images around the plastic waste issue are sort of sad, right? And it's from the beginning, it's been images like these that have really united our response on this problem. We have this responsibility to care for wildlife, to ensure that thousands of wonderful and diverse species have a healthy ecosystem that they can thrive in, right? So unfortunately, like Jake mentioned, these everyday plastic items that are ending up in nature and taking forever to break down, while they're there, they're causing a lot of problems. And we know that sea turtles and birds and seals and even manatees were some of the first species to have ever recorded to have suffered the consequences of plastic pollution. But it's been estimated that actually over 700 species have come in contact with it. And researchers are predicting that by 2050, 99% of seabirds will have ingested plastic. So, humanity has already really wiped out 60% of vertebrate species since 1970. So, at the rate we're going right now, if we don't do something about this, plastic waste will continue to be a factor in the health of our ocean species. And we know that healthy oceans are essential to our lives, right? They hold roughly 97% of the water, but they also produce more than half the oxygen we need to breathe. Just think about that for a second. Every second breath you're taking while watching me babble on is something that the ocean has helped provide for you. And the oceans provide food for us. The seafood accounts for 1/6 of the animal protein that we consume. They're also a significant economic driver, providing incomes for people in fishing and tourism industries. And these are really important in middle and low income countries. Pollution like this can pose a significant health risk, right? In places where there's not a lot of waste infrastructure, there's a lot of burning of waste, and that can release toxic gases, which makes it hard to breathe, can cause respiratory, heart, and nervous system damage, sorry. And then, of course, pollutions like this in this picture along coastlines where it accumulates can be these favorable breeding grounds for disease-carrying organisms like insects and rodents. So, with many issues of biodiversity loss, the loss of marine wildlife disproportionately affects the world's poor, affecting these populations of people who live in places that lack adequate waste infrastructure, and they are therefore more dependent, obviously, on populations of wildlife for food and income. And we know that middle and low income countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, pictured here, have more plastic pollution than anywhere else in the world. And the magnitude of waste is so much higher because they tend to have less efficient waste management infrastructure to actually recover it, to recycle it, than we have in other higher income countries. So plastic pollution is also adding risk, right, to their health, of their economies, from local communities and livelihoods. In this way, it's reducing the health and abundance of fish populations, and this causes direct effects for local communities who depend on fisheries for food and livelihoods. And it becomes an added challenge, right, to these communities that are already facing resource scarcity and climate change. Pollution is a symptom of other challenges faced by impoverished populations. And that is the significant cause of this pollution is lacking infrastructure, right? And that's often driven by lack of resources that municipal governments have for critical services. So, like other global crises that we're facing, the pandemic is only making things more complicated, right? Today, single-use masks, latex gloves, other personal protective equipment, PPE, these have become features of our daily lives, right? And we're going to all say that's for good reason. At the same time, the use of plastic in shopping and in other sectors has been hit harder by the crisis and has possibly decreased. And so there's this question, will the pandemic end up producing a larger or smaller plastic footprint? It's possible, right? Early evidence is suggesting that we know that PPE is for sure trickling into our oceans. A recent study published suggests that COVID-19 has triggered an estimated 129 billion face masks and 65 billion gloves used additionally every month. They say that if you stitch all of those masks together, it would take up the entire land mass of Switzerland, for example. And that same study is estimating that by 2020, we will produce 30% more, so nearly a third more waste than 2019. So while we don't have actual data yet, right, we're still in it. The likely result will be there'll be a net increase in waste. And we know that because of that, and because our waste is already entering our ecosystems, that this additional waste will also find its way to nature. And so, to be clear, we're not about to ask medical professionals to take a break from their life-saving and sort through the recycling. And frankly, we have seen that PPE's critical role during this crisis is an important reminder of some of the benefits that plastic can offer to society, from the face masks and the test kits that have turned out to be some of our greatest weapons against the disease, to even the plastic wrapping that is extending shelf life on our food. And so, we've said before, we're not We're not saying that getting rid of plastic is the answer, but if we're not going to quit plastic, we really need to develop a healthier relationship with it and fix the broken pieces of the massive system. So, you know, WWF is going to tackle this problem the same way they tackle other complicated conservation challenges. They're going to take this one planet approach, right? They want to make sure that they are considering all of the things that we're trying to protect as they address the plastic waste crisis. This is a large scale problem. It's going to demand an equally large scale response. And so we are going to unite our global networks of industry leaders, of consumers, policymakers to transform the system so that the plastics we discard can become the plastics we use again. This is going to mean reducing our plastic wherever possible. Also, it's going to be about reimagining how we source, design, reuse, and dispose of plastic materials upon which all of these communities are depending on. To do that, we're going to need some big changes in consumer behavior. We're going to need some big changes in the private sector's approach to the way they produce it, the way they manage it when it's done. And if individuals and companies are going to be successful to chart a new course, then they're going to need governments to provide some clear guardrails and cities to participate. To achieve this vision of no plastic in nature by 2030, we're going to need to tackle this complex issue in a holistic fashion. We're going to need to touch every single intervention point along the life of the plastic. And so it's my job as the head of plastic waste and business, along with my amazing team, to help companies to play their part. So we are partnering with businesses across the planet to redesign how we source, use, and dispose of plastics. And so we think that by inspiring action across their sectors and supply chains, that we have the potential that for as few as 100 companies to prevent roughly 50 million metric tons of the world's plastic waste by 2030. And the great news is that some of the world's most powerful companies have already gotten started, right? They have these large scale plastic commitments to reduce, resource, recycle, and more, but they just don't quite have the path to get there yet. And here's why. It might be hard to believe, but plastic is a relatively new material to the world, but it's now ubiquitous, right? So half of the plastic that has ever been made was produced in the last 15 years. And that's been driven largely by the fact that it's demanded by so many people in industries, right? Healthcare, transportation, electronics, construction, food, they all rely on it because it's low cost, high performing, and it's really versatile. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, we spent a lot of time, rapidly innovating how we're going to use it and coming up with all these different types of it that we way outpaced our ability to actually do something with it when we were done with it, to recycle it. Let me take a glass of water. And this is especially the case in areas of the world where their populations are growing and economies are growing. And so to get out in front of this, to solve this problem, we really need to start at the root cause of it. So science is showing us that 80% of the marine litter, and so marine litter is the plastic that's going into the oceans, is coming from land. My goodness, so sorry. We joked about needing water, and I'm really needing water. So this means that most of the plastic trash that we see in the oceans today is coming from a broken waste management system on land. And so we needed to understand that, right? This major root cause, to look at not only how we use it, but what happens when we're done with it. So this kind of tells us we need to go beyond that idea of just getting rid of straws and shopping bags. While important, right? It's a key piece of this, you can see. It's not going to solve for it alone. So we need to tackle this complex issue in a holistic fashion, one that's going to engage the problem at key intervention points, like you can see here, along the entire life of the product. It's not going to be just one, right? It's not going to be one single answer that's going to solve this problem. And to get there, we need to have everyone. We need to have governments, business, and public, and engaging in a way to make that real meaningful change, so we can use and reuse plastic a lot better. It's going to be an entire paradigm shift in our relationship with plastics, though. And it's not going to be up to one group of people. It's going to be up to everyone to do their part to solve for this. And so we must, think about the way we're interacting with these materials all the way through their life. And we need to do it in a way that we don't negatively impact other critical issues that WWF is trying to address, right? And that could be climate change, forests, it could be food waste. So we have launched Resource, which is plastics we have launched Resource Plastic, which is WWF's Activation Hub. This is for companies that are ready, like I had said, to take that ambitious commitment they've already set into action, right? I want to be clear here. We need companies to be successful in their meeting their commitments in order for WWF to be successful in meeting our goal for no plastic in nature. And so we needed a program that closed that how gap, that took us from commitment to action. And so the way we do that is by helping companies to really understand, first of all, what their footprint is, right? So if they can measure where it's coming from, what they're making, and where it's going, then they can really understand where they have the biggest impact. And so if we can maximize where they're targeting their impacts first, we're going to have a greater long-term result, right? And if when they're asking those questions with their peers, in the same way, when they're measuring the same things, it's going to be easier to identify opportunities to collaborate and to innovate at scale, right? And so what Resource is doing is trying to solve what has been this impediment to progress so far in the plastic waste space, and that's measurement. So we developed a framework to close this measurement gap, and that's called the Resource Footprint Track. Erin, I'm going to share a video right now that talks a little bit more about that.
Plastic waste is poisoning our planet, and we can't fix the problem without the help of businesses across the world. To make a difference, companies first need the tools to measure exactly how much plastic they're using and track where it ends up, whether it's recycled, incinerated, landfilled, or discarded in nature. Resource Plastic fills this critical measurement gap with an innovative framework that helps companies analyze plastic use within and beyond their supply chain to identify the activities and cross-sectoral collaborations that could make a measurable difference. Now, we've released the Transparent 2020 report. Thanks to the thorough reporting of our partners, we were able to analyze the plastic footprint of 5 leading global companies. And with a consistent framework for measurement, this corporate transparency can help develop innovative solutions that can scale through collective action. Using our Resource Footprint Tracker methodology, we're measuring companies' progress against 3 key objectives. First, eliminate unnecessary plastics by reducing single-use items and adopting reusable systems as an alternative. Next, invest in sustainable production, using less virgin plastic while increasing recycled content. And finally, set a goal to double global recycling rates by developing a specific plan for each country. If enough companies join us, we can gather the data needed to prevent more than 50 million tons of plastic pollution by 2030 and make an impact on the global plastic waste crisis.
Right. So as this video touched on, our annual transparent reporting series is a critical feature of our program. So this first report, Transparent 2020, was released in June. And so it debuted what is going to be this annual reporting series to track progress against these corporate plastic commitments. So this first report shows the initial results from the tracker and established a baseline for us to measure the progress of member companies year over year. The footprints are actually really quite unprecedented and really detailed for the first time. And so that's allowing us and member companies to sharpen the focus on the interventions and to take action where that data says it will maximize the potential for impact. It's going to allow companies for the first time to see shared challenges and, more importantly, shared opportunities, right? Because we need companies to work together to leverage their collective power, their collective resources and influence and actions so that we can move a lot quicker. And by 2030, we want this annual report to showcase that these companies, and then hopefully additionally those other 95 I was mentioning, will have together prevented a total of 50 million metric tons of plastic pollution. So that's our North Star. And so the findings of this report, they link how much and what kind of plastic companies are using to where it ends up in the world, and then uses that information to shape recommendations for actions and collaboration. And we frame the results against our theory of change, which was about 3 target areas to focus on with the member companies. The first is eliminating unnecessary plastic, so get rid of what you don't need. And then for what you do need, make sure you're making out of sustainable inputs like recycled content. And then, of course, third, we need to make sure we double global recycling and composting. Another key result out of this report was that the process itself of developing this first report identified an overarching need for better and more representative data. And so we've got a lot of work to do moving forward. But I want to share some specific examples of how this helped us really create this data-driven path. I mentioned that now we have this clearer picture of what's happening. And so when we sat down with companies to talk to them about what we needed them to do, it was much easier to have those conversations. So one example of this is around the US itself, right? So all 5 of these resource companies that participate in the report are US based. And the US represents the single biggest opportunity for recycling for them. And that's because they have high sales volume in the US. There's limited recycling infrastructure in the US, and we have really high landfill rates of 72%. What this means is there's this big gap between how much plastic these companies are putting into the system and then how much is actually getting recycled in the US. This is an incredible opportunity for them to come together and close the gap. This data point also shows us this bigger systematic issue in the US, which is that it's cheaper to landfill plastics than it is to recover and recycle it and use it again. And unfortunately, that hurts us because plastic has an inherent value, right? We need to make sure there's a market for it. And so we also recognize in that this system-wide change we're talking about to realize a circular economy for plastics in the US, that can't just be solved by companies. So sneak peek, announcing and launching next week, the US Plastic Pact will be launched with over 60 signatories. And what it's going to do is bring together activators across sectors and industries to collaboratively share learnings and drive actions in the US. The US Plastic Pact will foster collaboration and industry-led innovation between companies and governments to meet a set of ambitious targets and share goals by 2025. More to come next week. On an individual company level, this baseline assessment helped Starbucks to realize that the current set of goals they had didn't address the key areas of impact that their footprint showed were most urgent. And so through this process, we were able to overhaul their goals and help them engage more immediately where it matters the most. So we identified that we need to focus on recycling of their cold cups and address some of their more problematic small plastics and moving to a reuse model. And then finally, a number of the members found a high percentage of polypropylene, PP, in their US footprint. And the challenge here is that we need to increase polypropylene recycling in the US. And we also need to increase its use of recycled content. And those 2 things obviously work very closely together. Today, the US recycling rate for polypropylene is close to 0. And so right now we're using less than 1% post-consumer content. And so we supported the launch of this multi-stakeholder organization with a number of the members. And so the Polypropylene Coalition is setting out to be the change agent and to champion the recovery and recycling of polypropylene. So the goal of it is to really think about increasing access in curbside pickup, making sure it can be sorted better in the facilities, and then of course maintaining quality, this vibrant, robust end market for using it for recycled content. So I've spent a lot of time. I spend a lot of time these days really talking about how I can push these large multinational brands to do better. But I really want to emphasize here that there's this role for each of us in this and how we can each rethink our relationship with plastics. And I want you to start by taking action. And this seems really simple. But I think when we're tackling any of these really complicated global issues, it's easy to get overwhelmed. It's easy to feel like the actions we take are small and they're just not enough and they don't matter. But they do, they really do. So joining this webinar, learning more, this was a great start, right? And if the only thing you do beyond that is choose to not use a straw or choose to bring a reusable bag, that's great. Those are actions, right? I need you to take those. And I want you to know that you're not alone in feeling overwhelmed. In fact, sort of a story on the side that comes from this, this picture reminds me of is that when we started this out, I think we all of the stakeholders who were trying to solve for this problem felt that same way. We all felt overwhelmed about this. I think there was brands, there was governments, there was NGOs, all of us, wanted to do something, but we realized really quickly that it needed to be together. It needed to be a coordinated systems approach. And as you can imagine, with all of those perspectives and agendas at the table, that can be tough to do. And so I was a part of an expedition that was designed to sort of break down those barriers. And this is a picture of me actually on a beach in Bermuda, picking microplastics out of sargassum grass. But when we weren't on this beach, we were all trapped on a ship. And I say trapped because we had chosen to do that, but we were all stuck on the ship. And our choices were to work together, to have tough conversations, or to really jump into the Atlantic and in 9,000 feet of water and clean plastic out of sargassum grass that was floating there. So it was great. I mean, because on the ship were CEOs of chemical companies and brands and retailers. There was NGOs and collaborators, and there were some really extreme NGOs. There was Break Free from Plastic, and there was Greenpeace, and we all sat down and really started to get through these tough conversations. And while the actions coming out of that at times felt small, they were really important in catalyzing the work that has happened in the last few years. So it's just about getting started. It's doing those things first. And so one of the things you can do, right, is rethink how you use plastics on the go. I know not all of us are doing a lot of on the go these days, but when you do, think about water bottles and shopping bags and to-go containers. If you want to push a little bit further, think about bringing your own silverware, napkins. You can do those same things when you're in your home, right? Rethinking what you can reuse. But there's going to be times when you still need to use single-use plastics. And so when you're using those, you can carefully read labels and see if there are options to buy materials that are made of recycled content. You can also try to choose items that are in packaging that's accepted at your local recycling center. And then, of course, you want to make sure you're still choosing things that are keeping your food fresh so we avoid food waste. And finally, I really want you to recycle smart. Check with your local recycler about what is acceptable. Make sure you're following those guidelines. My mother, bless her heart, will literally listens to everything I say. She wants to just do what's right all the time. And she is somebody who I would call as an over recycler. And that's because she just wants so badly for everything to be recycled. She can't stand the idea of sending it to landfill. And so she puts it all in the bin in hopes that they will just eventually start recycling it. And the challenge there is, while that intention is so good, is that she's contaminating her bin of recycling. She's making it more difficult for the recyclers to pull out the stuff they can recycle. So, it's important to do that piece that is set that we have that your local recyclers can do now, and know that things like the US Pact are trying to make that better, right? Trying to fix the system that you are engaging in. Finally, you can advocate, right? You can advocate in many different ways. You can do it simply by using your purchasing power. You can do it by using your vote. If you really want to talk about what's getting recycled in your bin and you want to have a conversation, reach out to your recycler, find out why, write letters to your councilman. There's lots of options from small to big that you can take action on. World Wildlife Fund is fighting, right? We're fighting for a world with no plastic in nature by 2030. I don't want to start with these pictures where there are animals trapped in nets and where there's families floating in trash while they're trying to feed themselves, right? We want a world where our oceans are teeming with marine life, not nets, not bottles and bags. We don't want humans breathing toxic fumes because we're burning plastic. And we, of course, want all of these plastics that we sometimes really depend on, to be used to make another when we're done with them. So I hope you all want to be a part of that. I hope you all want to act. And so I want to open it up to questions to talk about how.
I hope that was a good refresher for everyone watching and a reminder of why this crucial issue is so important. Let's dive right in. Erin, thanks for being with us again today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. I think I'm going to call this recycled content. Sort of picking back up. Yeah. Just to obviously it's been a little bit. So what's changed since we last spoke?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. It feels like it's hard to tell time any longer in COVID times. So to recap, after we made some pretty big announcements, I feel like in that presentation, there's been a lot of great science that has come out to help us to continue to think about this issue. For one, World Wildlife Fund put out the Living Planet report in the fall, Living Planet Report 2020. And this report gives us some indicators of how good we're doing at taking care of the planet. and really trying to measure what our impact is. And what this last report showed was that humans are continuing to unfortunately overtax the planet at the expense of its health. And this is because we have these many demands that we put on the planet that are the engines of our everyday lives. But the imbalance of that, right, on the planet is pretty unsustainable. And unfortunately, we're just vastly outpacing the Earth's ability to really adjust to that growth. In fact, UNEP data showed us that we're really overusing the Earth's biocapacity by about 56%. And that just means we're just taking way more than the Earth can regenerate. I think in the previous presentation, we touched on Earth Overshoot Day, and that's the annual day where humanity's demand for ecological resources and services in a given year exceeds what the Earth can really regenerate and provide for us. And so in 2020, it fell in late August. So that's just 2/3 of the way through the year. And what that means, right, when you look at this Living Planet report, is that it really showcases what that means to our ecosystems and species. So since 1970, we've lost 85% of our wetlands. We've significantly altered 75% of our Earth's ice-free land surfaces. And of course, the stuff we talk about a lot in this plastic waste space is our oceans and our waterways. We've just polluted most of them. And this loss of ecosystems, this loss of land, equals a loss of species. So that same report said that as a result of all of these ecosystem changes and this just overtaxing of the planet, we've just seen a drop of more than 2/3 of species. That's 68% since 1970 of the world's vertebrate populations. And so that context in mind, right, about us sort of taking more than the Earth has to provide for us, it's important to note that at the back end of that, we're letting a lot of those resources go to waste. And so Pew, in partnership with some other organizations, put out a great report called Breaking the Plastic Wave. And it really set out to look at what would happen if we didn't do anything by 2040 in the plastic waste space, and what are some scenarios that could showcase us making progress, and what does that progress look like? And it really brought this dynamic of us taking more and wasting it from the planet into focus, and continue to push that topic of plastic waste as one of the key environmental agenda items at the top of our agendas, right? It touched on those large numbers of plastic waste entering the ocean every year. This one really pulled it up to 11 million metric tons. And it said that if we don't do anything by 2040, if we keep business as usual, we will have in fact generated twice as much plastic as we have today. That will mean that 3 times as much will actually end up in our oceans, and that will accumulate to 4 times the amount of stock in our oceans. So if you just want to picture what that means from an amount perspective, that would equal to about 50 kilograms of plastic waste per meter of global coastline. That's a lot of trash on our beaches. And so I think for WWF, what this science, these different scientific papers helped us to really think about is that we're done asking questions. We're done asking what needs to be done. And we're now about pushing for those stakeholders to take the right action forward and act on that information.
Yeah, that's really helpful to see, what happens when we do nothing. That's not an option anymore. And so it sounds like we have the tools for making the change. We've figured out what it is. We have those tools, and now we just need the partners for it. So who are those partners, or what does this look like for those individual companies?
Yeah. So that same Pew report that found that the pace of consumption, what that pace of consumption means for pollution in our oceans, also really highlighted the importance of collaboration and collective action for systems change, right? It really talked about how important it was that if we didn't do anything, like it just showcased what a hot mess we would be in. But with that risk, it identified this huge opportunity for governments and businesses and really innovators to lead this transition to a more sustainable world with more circular and sustainable materials. It also highlighted in its sets of scenarios that it sort of modeled out. There was one called systems change, and that was sort of like if we do it all right and we get to sort of, if we really turn this system around, it said that all of the elements for that scenario exist today or are already under in development. And they just need to be scaled up quickly. And what's so great about that is that it means we already have the tools in our toolbox to solve for this. And it just requires us, each of us as stakeholders to sort of lean in and do our part together. And so when we think about the role of businesses in that as a critical lever for change, I think we can talk a bit about how we're really working with them to evolve that conversation. In our previous presentation, I mentioned that World Wildlife Fund found that as few as 100 companies have this really huge potential to affect change in this system. And what we've seen progress on is that this number is really encouraging, obviously, but it's also very attainable. But we need to make sure in the process that we're making that businesses are measuring up to this potential and that they're really driving that shift from linear systems to shape this circular economy. And that starts with data-driven action, right? So we touched on that with resource plastic. We need companies to make large-scale commitments, and we need them to be paired with actions that will yield the most, right? The most impact where they have the greatest footprint. So both in their supply chains and beyond. We need them to measure that impact so we know what's working and what's not. And then so we can help them design good strategies to dedicate resources and effective interventions. And then this consistent reporting is required to get to this point. And so that's why we developed the resource footprint tracker. And what's been exciting in the past, less than a year is that it is now seen as the best viable tool to ensure data is really accurately collected and communicated. And so this year we're expanding the tracker's use from that 5 in the pilot to over 90 organizations in the plastic value chain. So just really showcasing the value of how far we can raise the ambition when we understand what's happening. And one of the things that's highlighted is how companies and where they can engage collectively in this space. And so we were just about to launch when we last spoke the US Plastics Pact, and it's a collective action platform in the US, really bringing together companies, cities, governments, and value chain members to join together for shared common objectives in the US to get to circularity, which we are not right now. We're at about 9% recycling rates of plastic, and that means about 75% of that plastic is ending up in landfills. So we've got a lot of work to do here. But it also highlighted the need for not just place-based action, but sort of frameworks that enable the conditions for impact. And that's what's really exciting, is that it's moved us to like raising the ambition around policy with businesses where we haven't been able to in the past. So, and that's because despite all of this work they're doing, despite doubling of voluntary initiatives over the last few years, plastic pollution continues to grow. And so businesses are taking responsibility in many cases to address the challenge, and I'm not saying all, but many, of plastic pollution within their own supply chains. But they have identified that a UN treaty would be necessary actually to coordinate those stakeholder actions and really solve the plastic pollution crisis at scale. And so now we have companies advocating for the UN to vote to implement a treaty as a critical framework to really help enable that widespread action that they need to be successful. So pretty exciting.
I like that you talk about it as a framework because it's really building out a space for them to take a place and see where everybody goes. The thing that's most interesting to me is that, companies historically have been relatively reluctant to support policies in this space. So that's really interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's so true, especially US-based companies, right? Mm-hmm. And but it's changed a little bit in the last few years, and we're starting to see what that looks like in really visible actions and commitments, right? So we're currently finalizing a report that's going to be due out later this year that's going to outline exactly what tangible progress looks like in the US. However, in the meantime, I can really tell you about what that growing ambition for actionable policy is looking like in this space. And so let me start with a great example of our beverage companies in the US, right? We've partnered closely with many of them for a long time, we've historically hit a wall on policy in the US. And so they may have supported EPR, and let me clarify what EPR is. That's extended producer responsibility. And that just means that essentially for every product that's put on the marketplace, a producer has to pay to have it managed, recovered, recycled, et cetera. And so they've supported these EPR programs in other countries, but they weren't supportive of them in the US for a variety of reasons. But as we've looked at this, as we've looked at the situation in the US, as we've realized the requirement for us to have more systems change happen in this shared community, we've begun conversations and leveraged those relationships we've had with them, and leveraged the relationship we have with American Beverage Association, which is their broader industry group, to evolve that view and evolve their thinking on how more effective policies could be really productive in them meeting their targets and their objectives. And so now we're seeing beverage companies not only shift their sustainability agendas, but become much more vocal about their support for policies and actually trying to bring other companies on board, right? Realizing that they don't just need it to benefit them, but they need it to benefit others at the same time. Here, the shift is occurring simultaneously across multiple sectors, leading the US to really emerge more as a prominent leader, where it's been sort of a laggard over the past few years. And so what we've seen is this momentum in the US Plastics Pact, which launched in the fall. I think when we were doing this, it was just the week before, and it was launched with over 90 businesses, NGOs, municipal leaders, and other stakeholders. And just last month, actually, the US Plastic Pact released its roadmap. And what that roadmap showed was not only that we came together to do something, but it outlined an aggressive and really actionable set of targets. At the heart of those targets are that we have this timeline in the US Plastic Pact to shift the US system by 2025. I just want to repeat that, by 2025. That's basically 4 years from now. And what it aims to do is get rid of the stuff that doesn't go in the system. So define and eliminate those things that are problematic and unnecessary. And then also to make sure that anything that goes into the system is 100% reusable, recyclable, and compostable. So it's not allowed to go in that shared system if it doesn't technically work in it. And then, of course, enable policies and investment so that that material can come back and be used again and again. We also see, and this is really exciting, the US stepping up with our newest coalition, OneSource, which is really rallying American-based companies around how do we influence this administration and this Congress through a three-pronged approach to strategize around public policy in the US and getting us to a more circular system. Elements of that include extended producer responsibility, environmental justice. Of course, we need to be putting solutions into place that are equitable. And then we need the US to stand up on the global stage. We need to stand up as an international leader because the US can play a much more active role in developing that global treaty if they're at the table. And of course, because of that and the understanding that companies have about these important frameworks, these important elements of policy, they're advocating for the treaty. We've got 30 major businesses who backed our business call to action last fall, urging governments to negotiate and agree on a UN treaty on plastic pollution. And this is really the first time these companies have publicly called on governments to adopt a treaty on plastic pollution. And that just shows that they recognize the need to continue to address the challenge within their own supply chains. And those supply chains don't know global borders.
I mean, I love that it's a short time frame, that by 2025 too, because that's showing the urgency instead of some, by the year 3025, sure, we'll figure out something. No, that's not going to work for the short-term need that we have. And it's been a slog. You've been in this space, really knee deep in it, literally, as you've been working in the plastic space. Individuals, some of us are tired. We've been trying to also do our best that we can all these years. And so it is encouraging to hear that businesses and governments are getting on board, but we're still invigorated to make the needed change. So how can we as individuals continue to help also over a shorter time frame, maybe over the next year or two?
Yeah, I mean, it does sometimes feel like a slog, but if anything, I would say that our ambition is ramping up. And so we're hoping and seeing that our stakeholders are rising with us. I think we always talk about these inflection points. And so what's been really unique about the plastic space is this rate of change. So while it's really easy to feel like actions don't matter when you don't see the change happening every day, it's really critical that we all keep the momentum going, that we all continue to do our part. And so from our viewpoint at World Wildlife Fund, we know change is happening. We can feel it in the shift from these corporations especially. And that gives us a ton of hope, right? And it energizes us to keep driving forward and really bringing everyone along for the ride. I think there's so much in store in the future, right? Even in the next 6 months, we set ourselves up for important conversations with the Biden administration and getting them ready to discuss these issues at scale with world leaders. We really need to make sure that this administration is advancing an accessible and equitable system in the US, and that the US is a part of the conversation about shifting materials to be more globally managed. We need to make sure we ensure and address the climate planet nexus. They are so interconnected, and these systematic drivers cannot be acknowledged without one another, right? That one planet perspective that WWF is always taking is about making sure we don't lose sight of how interconnected our world systems are. And so policymakers and businesses need to keep this in mind, right? And so we need to help them to understand that so we can frame our recommendations and strategies and solutions we have for them to take on. Looking further out, we're really excited, of course, about our Transparent 2021 report coming out later this year. And again, even if it seems like there's a lack of major change, what this report is going to prove is that progress is happening. It's going to tell us that companies are ready to make decisions in areas where they have direct control, whether that's in implementing new business models like reuse, whether that's efforts to source more recycled content, and even commitments to reduce their use of virgin plastic altogether. And that's where we're going to really see business showing up in 2021 and beyond. And so continuing to support and advocate for that. And then we need to continue to raise awareness at the consumer level, of course. If we're going to close the loop, we need individuals to take actions as well. And the public is just an important element of that. We need them to push for policy and, of course, continue to push the pressure on businesses to make changes. Our public opinion polling shows overwhelmingly that people support this desire and that they are already showing up, right? By their signing petitions, they're taking pledges, and they're asking us a million questions about what they can do and what they should be doing to help. And so now it's just up to us. It's up to WWF. It's up to businesses and policymakers to really remove that system complexity. And then that can empower individuals to be able to have more impact with every action that they take.
I love that. That's really helpful. It's inspiring for, to know that if we can actually do the right thing, we'll take those actions, we'll take those steps. I think people are hungry for that kind of support. And the last question, for you, that's kind of a two-part. What is still challenging us, and what gives you hope?
Yeah, I think, interestingly enough, our biggest challenge happens to be optics, sort of touching on some of the points I was talking about earlier. As soon as someone knows the root of a problem and knows how to fix it, they want to see action happen really quickly. They want it now, right? But global systems change just doesn't happen overnight, and it can feel really frustrating. And so we are constantly facing the optics of not making as much progress as we actually are. And so while it might not feel fast enough for the planet, the truth is that we've made more progress in the last 5 years than we've made in the 40 years before that. I can't really talk beyond that. I wasn't alive then, but I can confidently tell you that what's happening today and what's proof of what I just talked about, just the level of ambition that's sort of that's shifting and moving, is that we're seeing this progress, right? And so we will continue, as all of our stakeholders raise their ambition, we will continue to raise the bar further, because that's what our planet needs. And we see that support from our stakeholders, from individuals, from the public, growing stronger every day around this issue. And that gives me a lot of hope. I mean, honestly, I would rather be challenged by this, right, by optics than by actual progress. So I feel like we have so much in store for us in this next year. We've got the right stakeholders listening to us and energized by it. We've got, we've got support from our members and from the public to make more progress on this. So I think I'm excited to see what we would come back to in 12 months from now to see what has happened.
Well, that's great. So we're just going to book, July 7th, 2022 for us to catch up again.
Yeah.
But this is great, and thank you for the work that you're doing, and it's great to hear that what you're hearing from business, from government, and I know that I certainly hear from our supporters about their enthusiasm about this momentum and what they're demanding as a consumer and with their actions. It's really exciting. So it's not going to be the last time we check in with you on this topic. So looking forward to our next conversation. So to all of you, our WWF supporters, we appreciate that you took the time to join us today for this installment of the Insider Series. As always, we will be following up with an email that includes a link to the recording of today's program, which we hope you'll share with your family and friends. The email will also include a link to a survey about your virtual experience today, and we review all those comments and love your honest feedback. Finally, we hope you will join us for our next installment of the Insider Series. On July 29th, Stuart Chapman will be with us again as a follow-up to his presentation from February about WWF's effort to double the number of tigers in the wild. So we'll hope you tune in then. Thanks again for joining us and for your commitment to conservation and WWF. See you next time.
Your passion and generosity are helping build a more resilient future for nature and people. And while we are all staying home and staying safe, your commitment is still helping to make conservation progress happen all over the world. From the U.S. Northern Great Plains to the Arctic, from the Eastern Himalayas to the savannas of Africa. Your commitment fuels work that safeguards local communities, iconic wildlife, and vast land and waterscapes. Together, we're developing innovative solutions to ensure the health of our planet.
Your support is helping to take us to a whole new level in our work.
Support that people like you have provided has achieved so much.
Thank you for your generous support.
Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you for your support.
We can't do the work that we do alone.
We're doing all of this great work at WWF. We have all of these amazing supporters out there. And it is really nice to be able to connect with the people that enable us to do this work.